An investigation has shed new light on the tragic sinking of the Bayesian Yacht.
A report gives the fullest account yet of the accident and how its passengers tried to escape.
Tech billionaire Mike Lynch, his daughter and 5 others were killed when the Bayesian was hit by high winds in August last year.
Hello and welcome to the Nexus. This week we're taking a look at the Bayesian super yacht investigation, and there have been 2 big developments in recent days. The salvage operation just off the coast of Sicily has brought some of the wreck to the surface, and British investigators released an official interim report with some crucial new details about the yacht's design. Ultimately, investigators want to know what caused the yacht to sink, and we'll be asking our panel of experts just that. Maritime Historian Sal Mercogliano is with us, as is Oceanographer Boxall, and the salvage expert Captain Nick Sloane. Well, just before we get to them, a quick reminder of what happened back in August last year. These were the last pictures of the Bayesian before it sank, its 72-metre mast just visible from the coast. 22 people were on board, 7 of them perished, including the British billionaire Mike Lynch and his 18-year-old daughter Hannah. 2 of his business associates and their wives and a chef also died. The captain and the rest of the crew survived. Mr. Lynch and his guests had been celebrating his recent court victory in America, where he'd been cleared of committing a massive financial fraud, an offence which could have put him behind bars for years. Mr. Lynch had every reason to feel safe aboard his $40 million yacht. It was said by its designers to be unsinkable, and on the night of the incident, the Bayesian was taking shelter from the forecast storm in Porticello, where the seas were calm. But in the early hours, the winds picked up considerably, and at around 3:57 in the morning, both the Bayesian and another yacht nearby, the Sir Robert Baden-Powell, began to drag anchor. The Baden-Powell weathered the storm, and its captain spoke to reporters hours after rescuing survivors from the Bayesian.
No, we were hit by a violent gust yesterday, a tornado, water tornado, I think they call it. In the morning at 3 o'clock, around 3 o'clock, we noticed weather coming, and when it appeared, we started our engine to keep the ship in position, and we had the other yacht behind us. And a moment later, she was gone, and we couldn't declare what happened.
And that, of course, is what investigators are trying to work out right now. So let's bring in our guests, and today we have the Maritime Historian Sal Mercogliano, the Oceanographer Dr. Boxall, and the salvage expert Captain Nick Sloane. Welcome to the program, everyone. If I may start with a very blunt question, first to you, Nick. Given the information that you have at the moment, and you've read, as has everyone on the panel, the report from the Marine Accident Investigation Branch of the British government, what do you think caused the Bayesian to sink?
Yeah, well, Matthew, I think it's a very sudden and abnormal weather phenomenon, whether it was a downburst or cyclonic water spout. But certainly, if the forecast was for force 4 or 5 with a few thunderstorms, and you've got 70 knots, and then after 70 knots, something happened that dramatically knocked the Bayesian over, I would say that's very sudden. If you look at the timeline from sort of 3:55 into 4:06, in that 10 minutes, conditions deteriorated dramatically, and an extreme weather phenomenon.
Simon, your brief answer?
I think you can put it down to a freak weather incident, as has just been said, and also the fact that the Bayesian is quite a unique yacht in terms of its size of its mast and where it was sitting at the time. So a combination of unfortunate events.
Sal?
I think there was very little the crew could have done beyond preparing for what they did for the events that transpired. Getting underway would have been a difficult one, and it's just really kind of a confluence of events right there.
So, Nick, all of you have mentioned the freak weather conditions, and Simon in particular, have mentioned the design of the yacht. Let's take the weather first, though. Can you describe to us how it developed so quickly?
Well, I think the forecast was that there was a low system that was coming from Genoa and heading south through the Tyrrhenian Sea towards Sicily. And forecast was for force 4, force 5 with maybe some thunderstorm activities. But as the system enters the Bay of Palermo and the shallow water, it obviously gets a lot more energy from the warmer waters in the shallow water. That increases the thunderstorm activity. I would imagine that as the wind increased above force 5, sort of force 7, force 8, it's now tumbling over the headland, and there's a bit of a wind shear, and it comes down into the lee of the Bay of Palermo to where the 2 yachts were anchored. And as it tumbles, it either gets cyclonic activity or this downburst, and increases dramatically, and it's a very localized weather phenomenon. Literally, the other yacht wasn't only a couple of 100 meters away and did not experience the hurricane force winds. So yeah, certainly an abnormal freak weather incident on that lee side of the headland.
Yeah. Simon, do you agree that the downburst seemed to have hit the Bayesian and yet didn't quite reach the Baden-Powell?
I think it hit both vessels, and I looked the day after the event at the historical weather data from the Palermo airport, and you could see that the winds were light, force 3, 4, and then suddenly there was a switch in direction. It swirled round, and in the space of 20 minutes, half an hour, it moved, and that was as far away as 20 kilometers. So the epicenter of that downburst, we call it a water spout if you like, it meant it went from force 3 to typically force 10, 11, and that was completely unpredictable. However, at the moment, the climate change, the Mediterranean last August was the warmest it's ever been, and that helps fuel these unique weather events.
And Nick, you suspect that the Baden-Powell may not have been hit by the downburst. Why?
Well, no, she might have been hit by the downburst, but maybe not the full force of 70 knots. She might have been on the periphery where it's still 30 to 40 knots. They did not report any of the canvas covers being ripped off. And I think that the sudden impact of that 70 knot plus wind that hit the Bayesian, that actually completely tore off the flying bridge canvas, would mean that she was in the focal point. So yeah, maybe a couple of 100 meters, you're still hit by that downburst, but maybe not the epicenter of it.
Sal, we've got some pictures which you've sent us of a downburst. Can you just describe, we can actually see the shape of it, how it forms?
Yeah, you're dealing with a lot of force coming in a very concentrated area. And when you're a ship like Bayesian and you're getting hit on the sides by this wind force, you're going to start to heel. And what this microburst downdraft could have done was really apply an extreme amount of force while the ship is healing. And that is probably what we saw push it over. You're getting this very concentrated area, massive amounts of wind, weather, water coming down at you. And it's just applying massive amounts of pressure up against the hull. And that's probably why we saw Bayesian suffer this catastrophic loss.
So, Nick, the captain of the Bayesian sailed from Cefalù to Porticello to shelter from the storm. Was that a good decision? Did he just get unlucky?
Yeah, I would say with the forecast conditions being force 4, force 5, northwesterly, then he was in the lee and calmer waters and the pretty good anchorage position. I think the weather from midnight through to 3 o'clock was below 10 knots, and it was only after 3 that the approaching storm, and there was a slight increase of weather. But literally from 3:55 to 6 minutes past 4, that's when the extreme weather phenomenon hit the yacht itself. So I would say certainly in the wrong place, the wrong time. As was mentioned, her mast is huge.
And I know, Simon, you mentioned that you think the downburst probably hit the neighboring Baden-Powell and the Bayesian. So the difference is not so much the weather conditions, but the design of the vessel. The official report mentions its 72-meter mast, one of the tallest in the world. It mentions its sails, which were down at the time it was hit by the storm, and the centerboard was retracted. The report also includes computer modeling indicating that in these circumstances, the Bayesian would capsize if hit by winds exceeding 116 kilometers per hour. It was hit by winds of 130 kilometers per hour. The modelling also suggests it would be unrecoverable past 70.6 degrees. And as we all know now, it was knocked over 90 degrees in just 15 seconds. Simon, given the computer modelling, was the Bayesian always going to be risky to sail?
No, I think there are two things here. I think the Baden-Powell didn't suffer the same fate because her masts were a much smaller surface area. I've actually seen the mast for the Bayesian laid out on the quayside alongside our department. She actually came in to have her mast refitted. The mast is big. We're talking huge. You can walk up the middle of the mast. It's that thick, it's that wide. It's acting like a sail. The other thing is that the Baden-Powell has a set sort of ballast in its hull, whereas the Bayesian has a retractable centerboard. And it was up. Normally it goes down to 10 meters. That counterbalances the wind. So with the centerboard down, it would have survived that downburst. But there was no reason for the centerboard to be down. Plus the fact that anchor, sometimes a 10-meter sort of weight dangling down below the vessel can cause further complications to the anchor chain. So the crew did nothing wrong given the weather conditions, given what was predicted. But the Bayesian is unique in terms of that huge mast, which acts just like a sail.
The people who watch our videos and have watched you three together and separately are well-educated, very interested people, and they make very well-informed comments. And many of them ask the question, are you sure that the keel or the centerboard shouldn't be down? Simon, you've already answered. Sal?
I think in hindsight, we're looking here, of course, but, you always are trading off decisions and, negatives. That centerboard down, as was mentioned, you can get fouled in your anchor. If you start drifting, if you start dragging your anchor and that centerboard strikes land, you could potentially heel the vessel over and cause more problems. And so there's always this kind of weighing that the crew has to do. But I do think in the time period they had, they were reacting very quickly to the situation. There was not a lot of time to drop that centerboard. They were trying to get power up. They were trying to really just prevent a drift at that moment. So again, standard practice was to keep the centerboard up, but there's no doubt if that keel had been lowered, they would have been much better conditioned to survive the downburst.
Nick, should the centerboard have been up or down when they were moored, in Porticello?
Yeah, I would agree that, that they had been sailing around the islands for a few days. The crew know the vessel backwards, and they were quite confident that, at anchor with the keel up, that's the right thing to do. Obviously, it's a big centerboard, 60 tons of movable weight, so it would make a difference. But I don't think they had time to actually activate and drop the centerboard in. But from a planning point of view, I would say sitting at anchor with that forecast, have the centerboard up.
Simon, the official interim report mentions that the owners and the crew were not informed that the yacht couldn't withstand winds of over 116 kilometers per hour. The so-called stability information booklet didn't contain that sort of information. Why not, and is that an oversight?
I don't think it is. I think they would have been aware as experienced sailors that a very strong wind like that, they would actually be heading to an inner port and they would have the keel down to give them stability. You could argue that it's a very fine line in terms of the calculations, but an experienced sailor would have had the centerboard down had they been expecting those sorts of winds. More to the point, they would have upped anchor by then and they would actually be looking to head into any sort of storm, which helps give them stability. It gives them a much better chance of riding the storm.
Yeah.
And we know from the MAIB report that they started to get the engines going. These things don't happen quickly. I think we're used to jumping in a car, hitting the go button, and off we go. Marine engines can take 5, 10, even longer minutes to actually start up. And so they had done all the right things as this storm hit. But, given warning, they would have done different things. But it's not just down to that calculation. It's down to many years of experience with the crew.
Yes, and as you say, it takes time. And the report does go into a very detailed breakdown of the crew's actions that night. We'll just take a small segment of it, the crucial part of it. And it says, before going to bed, the skipper, James Cutfield, told deckhand 1 and 2 to wake him if the wind speed exceeded 20 knots or 37 kilometers per hour, or if the anchor started to drag. At 3 a.m., Deckhand 2 noted the wind was just at 8 knots and noticed thunderclouds and lightning was getting closer. At 3:55, he posted the storm on social media before closing the hatches and windows and noted that the wind was at 30 knots. At 3:57, Bayesian began dragging anchor. Just a couple of minutes later, at 4 a.m., Deckhand 2 woke the captain, and around the same time, the chief engineer woke and headed to the engine room to prepare to maneuver. But the wind suddenly increased to more than 70 knots, or 130 kilometers per hour. At 4:06, just 6 minutes after waking the captain, the Bayesian tipped 90 degrees and started to sink. It's estimated that it went from upright to horizontal in just 15 seconds. Sal, looking at that, everything happened so quickly. It must have been quite a terrifying few minutes. But did the crew act appropriately and in a timely fashion?
Well, I think you see the captain leaves good, clear standing orders for when he wants his deckhands to get him up. Sailing yachts are notorious for having small anchors and really not a good ability to hold ground in any sort of weather. So the captain left that standing orders. He got up, and you go further in the report, chief engineer got up, started firing up the engine, started putting all the propulsion systems up and running. They were preparing for what was expected to be a bad storm. I think they went through all the procedures they needed to prepare. Unfortunately, this weather came on them very fast, very quickly, and much more severe than they envisioned.
Just to zero in, and I don't mean to be unfair here, but it says that at 3:55, Deckhand 2 posted the storm on social media. Is that acceptable behavior, or should he have gone straight to the captain?
I think at 3:55, he is seeing a storm on the horizon. It hasn't really come up on them yet. It doesn't sound like they have encountered really the brunt of the storm or even the factors that would cause him to alert the captain at this point. And one of the reasons you go to sea is to see very unique things. And that's kind of what was captured there by the deckhand.
Simon, the Italian authorities are carrying out a manslaughter investigation into the captain. If that investigation comes to the same conclusions as this report, do you think the case ought to be dismissed?
Yes, I do. I think, looking at the report, bear in mind that this report is an interim report. There's still more information to come. They are still recovering the vessel, which might reveal other information. But given the interim report as it stands, then yes, I think that case should be dismissed.
Sal, the Italian investigation, what do you make of how they've conducted themselves?
Well, unfortunately, Italy has got a track record here for doing investigations on lost ships. Nick can talk about Costa Concordia, and what they are dealing with here is a very high-profile investigation. They are going to have to really be very careful in their details. Plus, we're dealing across with international lines, with different nationalities of crew. I think the Italians are going to come up with a very good eventual report here that's going to be done along with MAIB eventual final report.
And Nick, some commentators have said that more experienced deckhands could have made a difference, and that on a commercial as opposed to private yacht, they have to be better qualified. Is any of that true?
At 3:55, things were fine. At 3:57, things started to go wrong. So that's 2 minutes. It might have made a difference to sounding the alarm, but even when the crew and the skipper got up, she was only heeling over at 10 to 20 degrees, was what the average feedback that they got from everyone. So that's not too bad. Obviously, when the awning got torn off, that's when the wind sort of took a shear from 30 knots to 70 knots, and it ripped it off from the port side all the way off the starboard side on the flying bridge. And shortly thereafter, she got knocked flat. So things went dramatically wrong very quickly. But at that 2 minutes, at 3:55 to 3:57, I don't think anyone could be expected to sound the general alarm and to get everyone up.
Okay, let's move on to the salvage operation now, which started a couple of weeks ago, and the Bayesian was lying on its side 50 meters below the surface of the water. The main rescue crane doing the heavy lifting is the 83-meter-long HUIJBEN Lift 10, one of Europe's most powerful. The salvage team decided to remove the boom and mast first before attaching steel cables to the hull and lifting it to the surface. Nick, we know that tragically a 39-year-old Dutch diver lost his life preparing to remove the mast. Do you know how that happened?
Well, it hasn't been an official report, but there was a report of an underwater explosion that actually was felt on the Hebo 2, the work barge on the surface, and that they had initially attempted to remove the boom from the mast by the gooseneck. So the gooseneck is a fitting that actually goes into the mast. Obviously, it's a substantial boom. It's got the mainsail that fills down into the boom, so it's very substantial. And that removing it with spanners was not achievable. So they used what they call as a Broco gun. It's high pressure oxygen with magnesium rods and a copper sheath and a cutting torch. But the byproduct of that is hydrogen gas. And obviously the hydrogen gas can be an explosive risk. So even though it's a relatively quick cut, some of that gas must have been trapped somewhere, and there was a backflash and an underwater explosion. And at that depth, at 49, 50 meters, you've got 5 times the density of the water in the surface, and it's a massive blow.
Nick, some viewers online have asked, why was it necessary to cut it off? Why not raise the entire thing and then try to remove it?
Yeah, so basically, if you look at the amount of rigging that's on the boom with the main sheet and the preventer, the hydraulic ram, the running back, the backstays, all of the shrouds, forestays, you've got 3 head sails. All of that poses a threat to the divers when they firstly trying to install the rigging to recover the yacht itself. And of course, it just makes it far more complicated and complex when it's on the surface. So I think the prudent thing and the right thing is to actually remove all that rigging, either recover it all to the surface or leave it on the seabed out the way, so that it does not allow for the divers to be entangled and impact on the actual main objective, which is to recover the yacht.
Sal, how has the Bayesian tragedy affected the design of yachts going forward?
Well, I think we're going to be looking at a couple of things. Number one, stability calculations. Will there be stability calculations included in future publications regarding the ship in its non-sail configuration at an anchor? Something we didn't see for Bayesian. I think we're going to be looking at mast size again, because again, one of the big issues here that definitely stands out is the size of that mast on Bayesian. Unfortunately, what we're seeing is kind of a yacht arms race right now with millionaires and billionaires trying to outdo each other in their yachts. And when money talks, the builders will build what they can within standards. Regulations are usually written because of tragedies like this.
Simon, we're getting towards the end of the program. Aside from trying to sort of round off this awful tragedy for the family, and also demands from the insurers and investigators and so on, is there any value for the rest of the world to bringing the Bayesian to the surface and completing the examination of it?
I think there are 3 reasons here. First of all, one can get to the bottom of what was done. We're relying at the moment on log reports from the crew to say that hatches were shut, and we believe those, but we can double check that. But also, in those water depths, the Bayesian still represents a potential navigation hazard, and of course she is full of fuel. Although she's a yacht, she still carries fuel and other chemicals on board. So recovering her from the point of view of pollution, from the point of view of navigation, these are important things. But ultimately, it'll help clarify exactly what happened on that fateful night.
Just a final question. Mike Lynch and his co-defendant in his trial in America died within 1 day of each other. And he was thousands of miles away in England, hit by a car while running. Sorry to ask you all this because you're all experts and you don't want to speculate, but I'm afraid there is a lot of it online where they're saying, this is just too much of a coincidence. Does anybody on the panel suspect any foul play in this incident?
No, and sometimes weird and wrong things come together at the same time, and in this case, tragic things. So, it's very easy to go for conspiracy theories. There's no indication of anything like that here.
Nick, go ahead.
Yeah, I would say there's no way that you have any control of the weather and the weather phenomenon. You weren't aware of exactly where the yacht would be anchored. So unless they had a device that blew open the bottom of the yacht to sink her, but obviously the water came in when she was knocked down, and she went down, and there was still air trapped in the bow, because the bow was the last part to go down. So it's just a tragic event, and yeah, as Simon said, completely innocent coincidence in this case.
Sal?
Everything around this does create a bit of a conspiracy, but as Nick mentioned before, you know, this is a weather phenomenon. And one of the things that we saw happen here was some heroic efforts by the crew to save some of the passengers on board.
Sal Mercogliano, Simon Boxall, and Nick Sloane, thank you all very much. Really appreciate that. And thank you at home and on your phones for watching. If you want to see this episode or any of our previous episodes, do go to our channel on YouTube. Just type in Nexus, TRT World. Till next week then, goodbye.